9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed, Lloyd.
On October the 30th, 1938, a number of unidentified crafts landed in the small rural township of Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Witnesses reported seeing large cylindrical vessels from which emerged creatures described as being the size of bears, big, grayish, and with oily brown skin. V-shaped, lipless mouths surrounded by groups of tentacles. The creatures quickly retreated back into their vessels, perhaps aware of the pressure sickness to come from Earth's atmosphere. News stations near Grover's Mill began to report this strange, yet unexplained phenomenon, including this disturbing broadcast.
It strikes them head on. Logs are turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
A group of county police officers approached the extraterrestrials around 8 o'clock, reportedly waving a white banner and signaling for peace. Witnesses reported seeing a flash of light, followed by the disappearance of the officers. They would never be seen again. Shortly thereafter, the extraterrestrials moved towards New York City, where they were met unsuccessfully by the United States military. The aliens released poison gas, killing thousands of New Yorkers. A national crisis ensued, in which the United States and soon the world were conquered by the aliens. This story is, of course, a hoax, a Halloween scare conducted by the Mercury Theater on the Air, an acting troupe led by Orson Welles, who, on Halloween Eve 1938, introduced America to a never-before-seen kind of radio entertainment. Welles structured his show, an Americanized and radio-adapted version of H.G. Wells' 1898 novel The War of the Worlds, as a series of breaking news segments accompanied by intermittent musical broadcasts to make it more believable to radio listeners. The 60-minute broadcast included sounds of reporters choking on poison gas. And horrific descriptions of a country under attack from an alien army.
Engines are giving out. No chance to release bombs. Only one thing left, drop on the plane and all. We're diving on the first one. Now the engine's gone. Hey.
Welles and his team at CBS made plainly sure to inform listeners on multiple occasions that the broadcast was not a live newsreel, but simply a radio play. However, the damage had already been done. Even during the show, there would be a confrontation between CBS executives and police officers who were trying to get the show off the air, as they feared mass pandemonium would ensue. During credits and intermissions, the studio's phone switches would blow up as frantic callers tried to learn more about the fictional event, and others tried desperately to cancel the show altogether. Albert Frank is driving home with a friend from a trip to Everett, Washington. As they leave the Seattle metro area, a storm begins. Undeterred, the two continue into the Washington countryside. They're headed back to Concrete, Washington, a small boom town named after the factory which had put it on the map. The residents of Concrete, as elsewhere, tune into CBS to wind down that evening, October 30th, 1938, to some calming Tchaikovsky. To their shock, the music is interrupted by urgent news flashes that New York City is being torn to pieces by aliens. Some struggle to make preparations for the end of the world when the power shuts off. A substation is short-circuited, leaving the residents of Concrete without power. Panic, as residents fumbled their way through the dark town and exchanged what little information they had before what they feared was the apocalypse. Albert and his friend pull into town. A woman rushes out of her house to speak to the two young men. Screaming, she warns them hysterically of the end of the world. Frank and his friend try to calm the woman down. They lead her into the Eagles Club, where they find even more yelling and screaming. The town will not find out the truth until the power is restored, hours later. In the days and weeks following Welles' broadcast, newspapers such as the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and New York Journal began to write stories condemning it as irresponsible and having endangered millions upon millions of Americans. To their analysis, 1.7 million had believed Welles' drama, and of those, 1.2 million were frightened or disturbed. Welles himself would receive thousands of letters of concern after the broadcast, and would exit his studio that night surrounded by a mob of angry, concerned people in the throes of the Great Depression. And that was it. An irresponsible radio drama had driven the whole of its country to its knees. Or so the news had said. In 1940, a lone Princeton psychology professor set out to write an article on the burgeoning influence of radio communication. His name was Hadley Cantrell, a Utahn who had studied at Dartmouth and Harvard, where he received his PhD in psychology. In 1936, he would begin his work at Princeton University, where he would help pioneer the field of public opinions research, in which he predominantly analyzed radio's usefulness in controlling the masses. Described by his peers as pathologically ambitious, he would conduct a now famous study on Welles's broadcasts, which had occurred only 2 years prior, in search of a once-and-for-all declaration of radio's unlimited power to influence listeners. Using an initial sample of only 135 interviewees, Cantrell deemed answers such as excited, disturbed, and frightened as damning evidence that Americans had believed the broadcast to be fact. Additionally, Cantrell widened his dataset weeks after the event to interviewees who did not own a telephone and thus had taken longer to respond to his study. By this time, newspaper reports of mass panic and millions fleeing their homes had essentially Mandela-affected themselves into these participants' minds, further muddying the study's results. These participants had developed a false memory of the event being much more chaotic and, indeed, much more important than it actually had been, due to the event's sensationalization in newspapers they had likely just read. In addition, Cantrell would cite the apparent spike in phone calls as evidence that calls to police stations and the military had exploded during the broadcast, but this was later explained as a mix of excited listeners calling their friends about the show, and well-meaning individuals trying to donate blood to fictional frontline soldiers, among other reasons. Nevertheless, he would have been remiss to report that no panic had occurred, because, as it seemed in 1940, the evidence was in plain sight. Newspapers had been quick to capitalize on the phenomenon, portraying Welles's broadcast as having been far more significant and detrimental than it had been in actuality. It's here that the influence of yellow journalism on how we remember this event becomes apparent. Yellow journalism, the practice of using sensational headlines and misinformation to attract attention to media, got its start in the late 19th century as competition between journalistic institutions became tighter and tighter. Hypergrowth in newly industrialized cities meant residents of all backgrounds and social classes wanted the news, and this increased demand only served to fatten the pockets of the magnates behind the journalism industry. Chief among these captains of industry were two bitter enemies, and their names were Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. In a battle to control the written media of New York City, these two magnates resorted to more and more sensational headlines during the 1890s, which was dubbed yellow journalism, after a Richard Outcault cartoon character named the Yellow Kid. Through the mid-1890s, Outcault would work for both Hearst and Pulitzer, and thus his most popular character became a sticking point between the two publishers. However, aside from the etymology, the implications of this period of history and communications are consequential, to say the least. Hearst and Pulitzer in many ways were the first of many to sacrifice the reliability of news in order to sell views. They became history's first clickbait. Communication is dictated by the opinions which one subscribes to, which is often in turn dictated by the media which one consumes. Thus, if a society is entrenched upon media which encourages sectionalism, division, and us versus them mentality, communication becomes sparse. This deficiency is expanded upon when established media openly defaces and discredits emerging media, for example in the battle between newspaper and radio. In many ways, radio represented the future, away from physical paper. Radio was convenient, much more so than perhaps newspaper. A large, one-use stack of paper, disposed of after reading perhaps a quarter of it. And yet, in this era, the magnates of the newspaper industry insisted on discrediting, misinforming, and expanding their foothold on the media market. This was their business, their inefficient, outdated business, but their business indeed. So, Hearst and the rest turned away from profiting off the controversies spawned by this new medium of radio, and towards openly and unabashedly trying to uproot the fledgling industry. If anything were needed to demonstrate both the irresponsibility that is so widespread in broadcasting and the radio's inherent shortcomings, the hysteria that followed Sunday's dramatization of the War of the Worlds provided abundant evidence. Centuries ago, the lawmakers of every civilized country recognized the lack of dependence that could be placed upon one man's oral statement and another man's understanding or misunderstanding, and insisted upon the written or printed word for everything of importance. And the advent of radio is today bringing a deeper recognition of how unreliable and, on occasion, how dangerous the spoken word can be. This is a quote from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer published immediately following Wells's broadcast. The hysteria which had erupted in concrete Washington provided the fuel the publication needed to write a story condemning radio. Of course, it would be misleading to brand this as yellow journalism, especially from a minor, local news source such as this. Perhaps if these smaller newspapers reported on it, it was true. The War of the Worlds had been irresponsible and consequential enough for this to matter. Except, the Seattle PI is owned by none other than Hearst Communications. Hearst and his many newspapers were quick to use Wells' broadcast to their own advantage, by painting the broadcast as way bigger of a deal than it had actually been, by painting radio as an industry of panic-causing vagrants. Hearst and other journalism magnates profited heavily. This was, of course, how yellow journalists like Hearst made their fortune. Gain attention through topical and misleading headlines, and keep it by shutting down any other avenues of information. Thus, these newspapers, a sizable amount owned by Hearst, became the most prominent primary sources of the event to this day, and Americans came to remember Wells's broadcast as the Great Scare of 1938. News for the longest time was the source of reliable information, which was untainted by commercial endeavors, but this, of course, changed in the early 20th century with the advent of yellow journalism. It's now commonplace for news media to favor shock headlines over real stories. This is the process in which Wells's War of the Worlds gained its undeserved and, indeed, unwanted mythos. The fact is, shocking headlines draw publicity, and increasingly during the age of easy and fast communication, news corporations learn how to profit from this attention. In addition to this, newspapers attempted to stunt the medium of radio as a Wild West, prone to anyone shouting fire in a crowded building at any time. After all, anyone can speak into a microphone and have millions across the country, and indeed the world, listen in to whatever it is they have to say. This sounds painfully familiar to the present day. The internet, Google, YouTube, social media, these sources simply cannot be trusted. Anyone with a computer can edit a Wikipedia page. Anyone with a microphone can upload a YouTube video about anything. It sounds terrifying, a sea of misinformation, hatred, and mutual misunderstanding. However, one must acknowledge that this Wild West is free, lawless, and cutthroat. It is in this environment, pure competition, that only the most reliable, understanding media ever sees the light of day. It is quite universally accepted that news has become biased and partisan to the point of conspiracy and pseudoscience, but unfortunately the business of news no longer lies in telling the unbiased, non-partisan story. Rather, the business of news centers around dividing. Perhaps it can even be said, misinforming people for the sake of consolidating influence over public spheres. Wells's War of the Worlds was not, as news magnates argued, the problem, with a fatality rate of exactly 0. It's safe to say that the written news was directly responsible for blowing Wells's broadcast completely out of proportion. The communication of information is essential to facilitating understanding, indeed, but news is no longer just that. It hasn't been since the 1890s. By horizontally integrating hundreds of news sources into just a handful of monopolies, by systematically discrediting any new mediums which pose a threat to the established news, by repeatedly tricking people to buy a paper, or subscribe to a magazine, or view an article, by blatantly promoting misinformation, sensationalizing headlines to the extreme, and catering to sectionalism to divide people into echo chambers of their own beliefs, the industry of news, our greatest form of communication as it pertains to current information, has fundamentally decreased the understanding of those who use it. Yellow journalism as a term has largely fallen out of use, replaced by words such as clickbait, content farming, and others. These are unmistakably the same few, terrible practices. In the modern age, it has become exponentially easy to inform oneself, to educate oneself of the world, and thereby increase one's understanding of the people, events, and things around them. However, with this, it has become even easier to be misinformed, to be misled, to be clickbaited in the spirit of generating just another view for some media magnate. Indeed, in the modern age, it is of the utmost importance to inform oneself. However, it is equally important to be wary of your sources.